In this teaching, we're going to continue to talk about the rock layers and how did they form. Now, throughout this series, I'm sure you realize I've been laying out the evidence that it really was Noah's flood, talked about in Genesis, that created the rock layers of the earth. But that's not what we'll hear throughout the museums and the textbooks and the classrooms and the universities. It will always be taught that there were millions and billions of years that went into the formation of these rock layers. So how is someone supposed to know what is the truth? Well, we're going to start out by looking at a very, sadly, common occurrence on this planet, and that is the reality of tsunamis. There have been two just in recent history, one in the Indonesia area where the ocean floor dropped, a wave front propagated all the way across the Pacific Ocean, crashing into that Indonesian island area. Thousands of people died, and that was from a mere 6-foot shift in the fault along the ocean bottom, created a tsunami causing massive damage in the islands. Another example was in 2011, a tsunami that impacted Japan, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But right now I'm going to take you to a tsunami. It happened in 1929 in Newfoundland, up above Maine. There was an earthquake off the coast of Newfoundland in the Atlantic Ocean. It was during the night, so the citizens that lived along the coast didn't know what was about to happen. Once again, there was a fault. The ocean dropped, a wave propagated and slammed into Newfoundland. It was estimated to be 150 foot tall as it slammed into one of the coastal towns, ripped apart many, many homes. Many people died. One of the pictures that was published in a newspaper after this disaster, where there was actually a house floating in the harbor. It picked the house up, washed it out to sea, and an old wooden schooner had to be hauling this house back to shore. You can imagine Grandpa waking up one morning after a deep sleep and looking out the window thinking, oh wow, I'm back out to sea at last, as his house floats through the harbor. But these tsunamis have enormous damage. Now, what's more interesting than just this wave of water is what it carries with it. You see, it wasn't until 1960s that some marine vessels and submarines went out and did some core drilling down into the sediment layer that was caused by this tsunami. Now, we know very precisely how rapidly that wavefront of mud was carried back out into the ocean. So as this wave front filled with mud moved back out into the ocean away from Newfoundland, it actually snapped. Telephone cable after telephone cable after telephone cable, the transatlantic cables on the ocean bottom in 1929, and it was tracked, so we knew the tsunami was moving at 60 miles per hour, carrying this mud out into the ocean. It went out 430 miles from shore, covering 40,000 square miles with a new layer of sediment that had not existed the very day before, averaging between 2 and 3 foot thick. So in 1960, they did core drilling, went down through to see what does this new sediment layer created by this waterborne catastrophe, what does it look like? To their amazement, the structure, the grain patterns, the actual look of this new sediment layer looked exactly like most of these huge, thick sediment layers that for years had been interpreted as slow, gradual settling under an ancient sea. As a matter of fact, somewhere between a half and a third of almost all sedimentary layers on the earth are now acknowledged they had to have been created by massive, rapid waterborne catastrophes, not slow, gradual settling. Now, just to get a feel for the power of moving water, I'm going to show you a short film that was taken by someone who actually was an eyewitness to the tsunami that swept into Japan in 2011. Watch the power of moving water and realize what you're about to witness is just water coming in from the ocean, backing up through a river valley, reaching about a 20-foot depth as it moves into this small, quiet Japanese fishing village. That's the picture I want you to get in your mind as you think about Noah's flood. Except that was 20 foot of water. During the flood, there were literally thousands of feet of water above every hill. You saw the hills in the background above that village? Imagine water 1,000 foot above those hills. Nothing could have survived that. It would have pulverized every bit of sediment. As you then mix that flowing water with more sediment, the erosive, corrosive, destructive power goes up by orders of magnitude. If you increase the speed of the moving water, it goes up by more orders of magnitude. You see, that's what created the sediment that turned into the rock layers that have covered our planet today. A real world-covering deluge that destroyed everything that existed before the flood. And it created those rock layers rapidly with no missing time between these layers. One other thing I would like to address before we go to the main body of teaching in this segment is how could the worldwide flood have pulverized enough sediment to lay down in places 10,000 feet of sedimentary rock? Honestly, that's part of why many modern geologists are very skeptical of the whole flood model. Well, Dr. Baumgartner, he's one of the world's most renowned experts in geophysics and has created a model to understand the movement of the Earth's continental plates. He's also a Bible-believing creationist. He has really developed a rather unique theory where he believes as the Earth's crusts slide across each other, during the flood they would have been moving much, much more rapidly. He believes there would have literally been a stick-slip effect as these continents are rapidly sliding past one another, where they're dropping 100, 200 feet at a time, creating enormous tsunami waves, one after another, not just for a matter of hours, but literally for weeks and months. This would have been pulverizing the Earth, creating the sediment that we find have been laid down by these moving waves of water to create the sedimentary rocks. What a lot of people don't understand is if the Earth was much flatter, if the original sediments were being removed and it was just smoothed out, there's enough water in the ocean basins of the Earth to totally cover the entire Earth to a depth of 8,000 feet. It isn't a question of where is the water that flooded the Earth. The question is, why is there so much water on this Earth? As a matter of fact, Dr. Henry Morris, who is the founder of modern creationism, he was a hydraulic engineer and he started to study the effects of floodwaters as he understood what the Bible was telling us about a world-covering flood. He was asked at one point, how can you not see that the world looks so old? Don't you see age everywhere you look at the rock layers? Dr. Morris looked right back at the interviewer and said, no, everywhere I look, the world looks flooded. Not old, but flooded. You see, that is the key in understanding the rock layers of the Earth. But what it means is that they were laid down rapidly, in sequence, one after another, not very, very slowly over huge periods of time. The Bible talks about 40 continuous days of rain. Where in Earth's history has it ever rained for 40 days and 40 nights? There's not enough water in the atmosphere, and there never has been. So people look at that and they say, obviously the Bible's a bunch of fictional fairy tales. Well, there's at least one possible model which would explain this sort of torrential downpour. You see, the Atlantic Ocean and the whole Atlantic basin has been formed because there's a mid-Atlantic ridge where enormous amounts of magma and lava poured out and shoved out into the current Atlantic Ocean basin. It's just unfathomable, thousands and thousands of cubic miles of material pouring out into the oceans. Now, this happened sometime during Earth history. Well, if you had, say, 8,000 degree magma pouring out thousands of cubic miles per hour into the ocean water, it literally would vaporize trillions of gallons of ocean water, shooting them high up into the atmosphere. So at least one possibility for explaining that 40 days of rain is that this ocean water shot high up into the atmosphere, 1,000 miles or more. It condensed and it came down as rain around the Earth, causing massive amounts of erosion and contributing to this pulverizing of the Earth's surface during Noah's flood. Now, nobody has a time machine. Creation scientists, just like evolutionary scientists, they're just approaching the data from a certain starting perspective. Their perspective being the Bible gives us a true model to understand history. So this isn't in the Bible, but it's one possible mechanism to explain where in the world did this 40 days of continuous rain come from. And I think it's rather intriguing and answers many potential issues that you would have by those who would just totally reject the Bible out of hand. So I thought this next little teaching, it would be great to bring it to you at the Meteor Crater National Natural Landmark. If you look behind me, you see this enormous crater. It's almost a mile across, and yet it was created by about a 150-foot diameter meteor that came careening and crashing into the earth at about 26,000 miles per hour. And it's the momentum, it's a mathematical combination of both speed and mass, and it pushed enormous amounts of earth up, creating this crater. Now, a couple teachings from this. People think of the Bible and they don't necessarily think of meteors and all sorts of scientific stuff. And yet, even meteors are mentioned in the Bible. In the book of Joshua, in one of the battles where God is bringing the Israelites into the promised land, there's literally prayer involved, and God uses natural things like meteors, but the timing is miraculous to stop the enemy forces and win the battle. If you look at our solar system, you see just the moon is cratered with meteors, and we see lots and lots and lots of meteor craters. And yet here on the Earth, we really don't see that many. Now there's two possible views of this. One leaves the idea that Noah's flood was a real event upon this Earth out of their thinking, and therefore the entire sequences of rock on the Earth are interpreted as being enormously old in age. The other viewpoint, which is a biblical viewpoint, is that the Bible means what it says. There has been a world-covering deluge on this planet. It would have laid down these rock layers rapidly. If the world was covered with water, and at that time of Earth history there were enormous amounts of meteors hitting this planet, the reason we don't see lots and lots of evidence is many of them hit during the water cover. Now this would be an exception. This would have happened much later on after the sedimentary layers formed, leaving a permanent crater, but we don't see them all over the planet. One other thing, you don't find millions and billions of meteorites buried inside of the rock layers of the Earth. Now, if there were billions of years of Earth history, there literally should be multiple billions of meteorites buried in those rock layers. There simply are not. It's one of those evidences I believe support that the rock layers of the Earth were laid down very rapidly. Therefore, you don't find billions of meteorites. The majority are found in the upper layers near the top surfaces of the Earth because they've happened in the last few thousand years since these rock layers formed. So these are just a few evidences that support a biblical viewpoint of Earth history, and I thought this would be a great place here at Meteor Crater to talk about them. One of the biggest questions that needs to be answered, especially to those who are critical of a biblical model of where all the rock layers and sediment came from, is how could all of the sediment required to make all of the sedimentary rock on this entire planet have happened in a one-year flood? It just seems impossible, honestly. I mean, even at the Grand Canyon, there is almost 6,000 feet of ground up sandstone and shale and limestone, which is sediment that formed from lime that formed in water that turned into rock layers. 6,000 vertical feet. And every geologist who has studied the whole area of the Grand Canyon Kaibab uplift understands there would have been another 6,000 feet of sediment on top of those Grand Canyon layers, which is all gone. It's all been flushed and washed away by moving water. So in excess of 2 miles of sediment. Where did it all come from? Well, where it came from was this earth was pulverized by the flood of Noah. The reason that modern geologists don't recognize where it came from is because they can't think big enough of a world-covering deluge and its consequences. But not only that, the mechanisms of the worldwide flood. You see, during this flood, as massive amounts of water were flushing over the land surfaces. A rising up of the ocean level floors that poured water out onto the existing continents. Probably subduction of the continental plates. As one plate slid underneath another, there could have been a stick-slip mechanism where entire fault lines running for thousands of miles would suddenly jerk forward and sink, causing tsunami waves hitting land surfaces at 100 miles an hour. Now, all of this causes massive water movement, which would have resulted in a force known as cavitation. Now, cavitation is when water is moving at extreme velocities. It literally, the water molecules pull away from the surface they're moving across due to frictional forces, leaving a vacuum bubble, a little microscopic at an atomic level vacuum. Now, there's a saying in physics that nature abhors a vacuum. It must be filled. And when the water molecules come slamming back in to fill that vacuum, it causes forces in excess of 20,000 pounds per square inch, exceeding that of a jackhammer enormously. Instantaneous surface temperatures reach thousands and thousands of degrees, and this literally hammers and pounds away at the rock surface. Now, we're here at Glen Canyon Dam because that's exactly what happened back in 1980 during a flood period of Lake Powell when they opened the spillways around the dam. The Department of the Interior put out a film about the flood at Glen Canyon Dam that showed the erosional forces of cavitation when those spillways are open. So I want to take a moment and just watch a part of this film to illustrate the powerful nature of moving water and its ability to totally pulverize surrounding rock layers.
Efforts were made to control this unanticipated rise of Lake Powell by operating the power plant at full capacity, thus releasing 28,000 cubic feet per second of water. But it was not enough, as inflow into Lake Powell rose quickly to over 90,000 cubic feet per second in early June, and the left spillway gates had to be opened. It was understood that these spillways would probably suffer some erosion by a physical process called cavitation. After only 4 days operation, inspectors found that cavitation had indeed been active at Glen Canyon. A photo taken by one of the inspectors disclosed holes in the concrete lining 20 feet wide and up to 4 feet deep. The spillways would have to be used, but the left one would carry most of the excess flow, thus preserving the right spillway for any future need. To reduce spillway use, wooden plywood flashboards 4 feet high were added to the spillway gates, and the outlet tubes were opened to bypass an additional 17,000 cubic feet per second of water. Although engineers had no way to see into operating spillways, they could tell what was happening by the action of the water emerging from the lower portal flip bucket. On June 19th, the left spillway stopped sweeping, indicating that erosion by cavitation was damaging the concrete tunnel lining. The flow was raised from 12,000 to 17,000 cubic feet per second, and the sweep resumed. But on June 28th, the sweeping again ceased. When the flow was raised, this time to 32,000 cubic feet per second, the increased flow brought forth sandstone-colored water. Pieces of concrete and rock were hurled from the spillway. Obviously, the spillway was being heavily damaged. The flow was immediately reduced and the water cleared. In the left tunnel, cavitation had initiated a series of large holes about 8 to 10 feet deep and 25 feet wide. They found the concrete lining gone for several feet up the sides. Steel reinforcing bars vibrated so violently by the moving water that they had broken off from metal fatigue. Most astonishing of all was the big hole at the elbow section, found to be 32 feet deep, 40 feet wide, and 150 feet long. Altogether, it was to be a massive repair undertaking to cost millions of dollars.
Now you'll notice in that video the size of the cavity that was dug out by that flowing water as it flowed through the spillway. If you were listening, what they did, they opened the spillway even further because the water kept rising and rising and rising behind the dam. They had to release that water. As it spilled over the dam, the integrity of the very dam would have been in danger and the dam could have collapsed. But when they opened up the spillway even further, they literally felt earthquake tremors on the dam. Now, if it could do that in minutes, think what 40 days and 40 nights and month after month of water flowing at 10, 20, 30 miles per hour would do. Mountains were pulverized by the flood waters of Noah, turning it into all of this sediment, which was redistributed to form the rock layers of the earth very, very rapidly. So this whole idea of slow, gradual settling and processes that created the rock layers don't fit what we know about the enormous forces of cavitation and water movement to create sediment layers. In this particular lesson, we're talking about the supposed missing time between the very different layers of rock that we see. Now, I am actually sitting on a very small section of the Navajo sandstone layer of rock in the southwestern United States. Now, this particular layer of sandstone extends for tens of thousands of square miles across the western United States. But there's a key question that you have to answer. Where did all that sand come from? The evolutionary perspective would be, at one time in the history of this area of the world, there was a sea that just washed in waves of sand, or maybe like the Sahara Desert, there were enormous dunes of sand that just built up and built up and built up. Eventually, they were overlaid by another layer of rock, which built up enormous pressure and fused that sand into a layer of rock called sandstone. And it would have taken millions of years to form, and then before the next layer, either above or below it, is identified, there may have been tens of millions, or in cases, well, we're talking about hundreds of millions of years of missing time as things got eroded away and then another layer was added on top. Well, is this the right explanation or not? This particular spot is a perfect place to examine that idea. As you look at this layer of sandstone, you see kind of angled, sloping lines where the sand was laid down. Now that could have been a sand dune, or it could have been an underwater deposit. But here's the key point as you look at this particular layer of strata. You'll notice the sloping lines come up, and then there is a perfectly cut off horizontal line, and then you'll see another set of sloping lines above this horizontal cutoff. It is as if this were a sand dune, it was sheared off horizontally before the next layer of sloping sand was added on top of it. Now, you never, any place in the world, see this happening in a sand dune. The top of a sand dune doesn't get sheared off in a perfectly flat horizontal surface, and then another sloping layer gets laid down on top of it. You also don't see it underneath a sea or ocean waves or on a beach. But there is one place we can see this exact thing happening, and that's in a flume study with very, very high velocity water and enormous amounts of sand and sediment captured inside of that water, almost like a mud slurry. There's so much sand, but it's flowing at 10, 20 miles per hour. Now, as it's flowing at those speeds, the sand will stay suspended. But if for whatever reason, after this wave of sand-filled water comes moving along, it slows down, the sand starts to drop out of the moving stream, and it will drop out in the flow direction, forming a sloping surface, which builds up and builds up and builds up. At this point, should another wave come along, or another stream of water from a different direction come along, it will shear that surface off in a flat horizontal layer until that flow slows down. Another sloping series will start. Do you understand? That's exactly what we see in the Navajo sandstone. We see these sloping surfaces and a sheared off horizontal shear plane, and then another layer with sloping surfaces, sometimes even at another angle, and a sheared off surface, layer after layer after layer. But the thing is, the Navajo sandstone covers an enormous part of the entire western United States. So it would have had to have been a flood of world hovering proportions to have laid down a 1,000-foot thick layer of sand in this way. And that's exactly what we find. It testifies in a dramatic way to the reality that Noah's flood happened on this planet, and that's why this rock layer exists. It fits no other explanation that I know of. It fits perfectly a rapidly flowing model of why the rock layer fits there, but it requires a worldwide flood as a consequence, and it removes any possibility of millions and billions of years, because these layers would have been laid down one wave after another after another. It may have taken a mere hours or days or weeks to form a 1,000-foot layer, not millions of years. Now here's another clue. The sand in the Navajo sandstone is very distinctive. You can actually do radiometric identification techniques where you're looking at certain isotopes of certain elements and you find them in the sand. And then you can look around the country and around the world and you see, where else do we find this exact same sand? It's literally like when you're watching CSI and they do DNA printing. They see an exact signature of someone's coded information. They find it on a crime scene and they can trace it back to that person. Well, that's what we can do with sand. And what they've discovered, most geologists would have to agree with this, the sand from the Navajo sandstone layer, 1,000-foot or more thick layer of sand in the southwestern United States, came from the Appalachian Mountains. Now you understand, these waves of water that are creating the rock layers of this earth are pulverizing everything. Well, the Appalachian Mountains are considered to be some of the, what are, quote, older mountains of the earth, much older than the Rocky Mountains. Now, why is that? Well, it's because during the flood, the sediment was laid down. Over the period of months, it formed into rock. As tectonic movement is going on, and the Appalachians probably were raising up above continuing tsunamis and waves, it was eroding away at these original sedimentary layers that formed the Appalachian Mountains. But here's the key point. Over 6,000 cubic miles. And to understand a cubic mile, you have to put it in perspective. What's a cubic mile compared to the size of the Empire State Building? And when you look at that, you see it's dwarfed. It's an unfathomable amount. And now we're talking 6,000 miles of the original Appalachians being ground up into sand, carried over 1,500 miles across the entire continent until that flow of fluid slowed down to the point it started to drop out of suspension and form the Navajo sandstone layer in the southwestern United States. You understand, no river could have done that. No huge long period of time could have done that. It had to have been a flood of worldwide proportions. It is literally the best explanation for why these rock layers exist. And yet students aren't even allowed to consider this possibility because they're systematically guided away from even considering the possibility the Bible means what it says when it talks about the worldwide flood of Noah. I brought us to Kodachrome Basin State Park here in Utah, where there's one of the most phenomenal examples of why this fits the evidence from the world around us better than any other explanation. As you look behind me, you see a white spire of sandstone shooting up through a brown layer of sandstone. Well, one of the most common anomalies in geology are things called intrusions or polystrat fossils. Now these are fossils from one layer that shoot up through multiple layers of strata. One of the classic examples can be found in Cokeville, Tennessee, where there is a fossilized petrified tree that shoots up through a layer of coal, goes into a layer of limestone, out of the layer of limestone, and back up into a layer of coal. Now, if you look in any geology textbook or any museum in the world, it will tell you coal formed hundreds of millions of years ago here on Earth as very slowly trees and plants died in a swamp and were buried under the water, which was highly acidic, and they didn't decay and were compressed and turned into coal mats all over the world. Limestone, we're told, formed under oceans, slow gradual settling of lime and shells of animals to form limestone layers under oceans. So to form a coal layer, followed by a limestone layer, followed by a coal layer, you would have to have a swamp above sea level, which slowly sank below sea level, followed by millions of years of accumulation of lime, which then rose above sea level, followed by another swamp creating another coal seam. Well, think about it. You have a tree trunk fossilized that shoots up through a coal layer, a limestone layer, and another coal layer. It would have had to remain standing for millions of years while these different layers formed, unless, ding, 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 there was a worldwide flood that rapidly laid down mats of vegetation that were covered with sediment, that were covered with more mats of vegetation, creating these multiple layers rapidly. But what does this have to do with this strata behind me? Well, you see hundreds of feet below this dark red sandstone layer, there is a layer of light tan-colored sandstone. Sometime during the formation of these two layers, that white sandstone was laid down, or at this time I believe it was more like a white sand slurry, followed very rapidly by trillions of pounds of a brown colored sand being washed in on top of it. And while that brown sand was still soft, maybe as it dried, maybe as there were seismic movements, there were cracks that formed, allowing the underlying sand to ooze up through the brown layer, forming these vertical columns in the sand. After that, these sediment layers hardened. Later in the flood, massive sheets of erosion were happening as the continents were lifting up. The Grand Escalade staircase of this area of Utah were lifted up, and sheets of water were washing off and washing away the upper laying sediments. A lot of the brown sandstone was washed away, leaving the harder columns of white sandstone just standing and jutting up through them. Now, that perfectly explains what we see, but think about the evolutionary explanation. For evolution to be true, you would literally have to have a layer of sandstone laid down over 1 million years or more. It couldn't have remained like a soft sand slurry. Another layer of sand, the red sand, laid on top of that, more millions or tens of millions of years passing, and then at some point the lower sand squeezing up through the upper sand. It makes no sense. Rock doesn't flow, it doesn't squeeze, it doesn't move up through other layers of sand that have laid there for millions of years. You see, if there was no other evidence in the world for the rapid deposition of layers, this should be enough to convince anybody with an open mind these layers were laid down sequentially and rapidly, one after another after another. They've looked at the sand size and type and morphology of the white sand. It matches the sandstone down below this layer. That is where it came from. Throughout this episode, we have talked about how rapidly rock layers formed all over this earth during Noah's flood. And yet there's a pervasive worldview that really permeates all of our education system that this flood has never occurred. That means the rock layers, the strata layers, the gravel beds of the earth had to have formed very, very slowly. It's the only other option. If the flood didn't form them rapidly, then huge periods of time must have passed. Now, each closing segment of the Rocks Cry Out series, I've tried to explain how blinding our preconceptions can be. How when we're trained to think in a certain way, it literally locks into our thinking that viewpoint to the point we miss the obvious. We can't even interpret things in any other way. Now let me give you an example of how paleontologists, that's people who study the fossils that are found in the rock layers, how they're trained to think, how their preconceptions guide their very interpretation of what they find. Now let's just pretend that I am a paleontologist and I'm out digging in the rock layers and I find a skull way down deep in a gravel bed. And I see something start to peek out. I get really excited because I find a skull and I clear out all of the rubble, and he's this perfectly formed skull. Huge, apparently vicious creature with extremely large teeth. And I have to ask myself, Where did this skull come from? How did he get buried in these rock layers? Well, if I happen to be the first one to find him, I get to name him. Maybe I'll call him the Bruceosaurus, and I put him in the museum and I characterize exactly what he looks like and so on. And then I go back to digging in the rock layers looking for another kind of creature. Looking further and further up, higher and higher into the rocks, and I get excited because I find another skull. This was found down lower. This one was found up higher, so I assume many years passed between the formation of one rock layer and the next rock layer, because the lower one must be much older. I've been taught that throughout my textbooks. Now they have the same general shape. This one has one ridge down the top of its skull. This one has two ridges. Same number of teeth, same general shape. And I have to ask myself, where did this second creature come from? Why does he look different? Suppose I found lots of them, and this is a full-grown adult, and this is a full-grown adult. Why is he such a different size? Well, this one must have had babies and offspring, and they had babies, and they had babies. And suppose where I found this one, I also found lots of trees and logs, and I think to myself, maybe being smaller gave him an advantage. So he survived better, and he made more copies of himself, and eventually, this creature evolved into this creature over huge periods of time, maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of years. He formed a similar looking but distinctly different kind of creature. Evolution happened. So I'm going to climb even farther up in the rock and strata layers to see what other kind of creatures can I find. And way further up, above the other two creatures, I find yet another skull. Similar shape again as the original one, but you'll notice his domed forehead is now starting to get higher. In this one, the jaw is sticking way out a lot farther than the original creature. So again, I have to ask myself, where did the third creature come from? He's higher up in the rock layers, which according to my worldview and teaching means he must have lived much later. He must be the descendant of the original animal. And yet he has a bigger brain and his jaw is sticking way out. So I just think, how do I explain this? Perhaps as this one and the subsequent smaller one had offspring, he discovered that if it dug underneath trees and it dug underneath rocks, that it could catch small animals and insects and eat them. And as it had a longer jaw, it had more of an advantage. So it had babies, and the ones with longer jaws, they were able to eat better and propagate themselves. And the longer the jaws were, the better it was able to survive. So by those modifications, just small random changes over hundreds of thousands of years, this creature developed into that one, and its bigger brain enabled it to know how to use its jaw in a different way. And a new kind of creature evolved. Then I go back to digging. Oh, and I get extremely excited. If this was my original creature, and now way up higher in the rock layers, he changed from this low sloping forehead to this high domed forehead, how did that happen? Well, I look at him and he's much smaller than the original creature. His brain, compared to his body, is much larger in proportion than the original creature, so he's probably much smarter. But he's so small, he'd have to be smarter. I found the Einstein of these kind of creatures because evolution has allowed him to grow a bigger brain and survive even though he has a much smaller body. So what have I done? I've found some bones and fossils in the rock layers, and then I've started to make assumptions, but it's just pure storytelling. You see, the first one that I showed you is not some ancient creature that lived long ago. This is the skull of a gray wolf. Now, every geneticist on the planet now can track the genetic code and the descendants of all of the different creatures that came from the coded information that was already buried inside of the gray wolf. The second skull I showed you, this isn't some 100,000, 200,000 million year old creature. It's actually a fox. And the genetic information to make a fox was already in the wolf. It was just sorted out as animals spread across and found new environments. And if they survived better, that little subset of information that was in the wolf was started to propagate to a distinct kind of creature called a fox. The third skull is not some much more intelligent, more highly evolved type creature that lived millions of years later. It's actually a bulldog. This is simply a little bit of information that was just sorted out by human beings in breeding practices to eliminate everything that looked like a general wolf type creature, and you grab a little subset of that information, breed away everything else, and you end up with a bulldog. It's not more intelligent, it's just the information that was already in the wolf to begin with. And the last creature, it's not the Einstein of these kind of animals, it's a Chihuahua. He's not smarter, he's not more intelligent, he wouldn't last for a matter of weeks out in the wild. He's simply some information that was already created inside of the wolf. Now what's the point? All the time students are shown skulls of very slope-shaped, small-brained, ape-like creatures. And then paleontologists will find bits and fragments of other bones where the skulls are a little bit bigger or there's less of a slope. And finally they'll see things that look very much human with a little more sloped foreheads than humans. And then finally fully formed humans. And they'll just line these skulls up and they'll say, see, this proves that apes turned into human beings. There is way less variation between ape skulls that have sloped or non-sloped foreheads and human skulls that have sloped or non-sloped foreheads than there is between the wolf and the Chihuahua. And yet in a matter of 100 years you can breed the information to create a Chihuahua right out of an original wolf type creature. It's all there to begin with. God did not want to create cookie cutter creatures. He created them with a DNA code that could vary widely to fit different environmental niches. But apes have always been apes. People have always been people. There is an enormous gap of information between them. Chihuahuas are interfertile with wolves. They're all the same created kind, just enormous variations. And everything you hear in textbooks and hear in movies about evolution is just storytelling to try to create this impression that everything could have made itself without God, when the evidence doesn't support it. The fossil evidence doesn't support it, the age of the rock layers doesn't support it, and the Bible directly contradicts it and tells us those creatures are there because they were created by God. Throughout this lesson, we have examined the rock layers of the earth and how there could not possibly be missing tens and hundreds of millions of years between the formation of the layers. We're standing here at Devil's Tower in Wyoming. Behind me you see an over 800-foot tall magma lava that has flowed up out of the earth into surrounding sediment. Now right now as you look at it you see, well, it's just standing up in the middle of the air. Imagine layer after layer after layer of rock 1,000 foot above the top of the tower you see behind me. That's what it looked like in this area in the early stages of Noah's flood, as enormous amounts of lava and 8,000 degree magma pushed up into this overlying soft sedimentary rocks that was forming above it. It formed and cooled what we call basalt. It's just a name of many kinds of lava which then cool and harden. As this magma cooled, it shrank, forming cracks which transformed into hexagonal rods. These are the tallest continuous hexagonal rods in the whole world here at Devil's Tower. Now geologists, as they go and they pull pieces of this rock off, they'll grab parts of it and they'll do radiometric dating, and they'll get enormously old dates. All of the park signs here at Devil's Tower tell millions of visitors that come through here this formation happened 50 million years ago. Now that is stated as an absolute fact. We've done this scientific dating method, radiometric dating, so we know this rock is 50 million years old. Well, do we or don't we? As I've previously discussed, similar cooled metamorphic rock such as granite contains crystals such as zircon, and there is still helium, one of the byproducts of this radiometric decay that happens inside of the rock crystals, inside of these rock layers. It could not possibly be there if the rocks were millions of years old. So yes, the radioactive decay happened, but it had to have happened rapidly, not at the rates we see it today. But there's an even bigger problem by absolutely assuming just because you read a radiometric dating method, it's giving the right dates. Let me take you to the Grand Canyon. You see on the screen a picture of a cross-section of the Grand Canyon. Now, down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, there are metamorphic rocks, lava flows that have happened. Now, that's considered to be the foundational layers of the Earth. And these layers, for years, were dated at 760 plus or minus 10 million years old, 0.7 billion years. And that's considered the Cambrian period of the Earth. Just simple forms of life were starting to form. Well, as we got more and more sophisticated in our dating methods, we would take rocks and we'd grab multiple different chemicals, multiple different isotopes. We'd line them up on a sloped curve called isochronic charts, and we'd come up with a date based on the linear arrangement or progression of these decays from different elements. Now, when that was done, the dates were downgraded to 719 plus or minus a few 100,000 years. So the date changed about 60 million years. More recently, what's considered a very accurate lead dating method has been used to date those lowest rock layers at 1.1 billion years. So the dates have ranged all over, even by modern scientific methods. But here's what's interesting. There has been a lava flow in relatively recent times that flowed enormous amounts of lava over the rim at the very top of the canyon. Remember, we're told the bottom layer way down here is 1.1 billion years old. And then layer upon layer upon layer upon layer was laid down. Then lava flowed at the top of the canyon, and those were also measured. Let me show you the results of very careful, meticulous work as that lava was measured using these same radiometric techniques. Using the potassium-argon dating method, those rocks, remember the lava at the very top of the canyon was measured at anywhere from 10,000 to 17 million years. That's 1,000 times discrepancy. 6 different measurements were taken from different chemicals. Then the rubidium-strontium method was used with 5 different measurements and 5 different chemicals found in that lava. The dates ranged from 1.2 to 1.4 billion years. Not 10,000, now we're in the billions. The rubantium isochron, which used multiple isotopes lined up in a statistical chart, came up with an age of 1.34 billion years. And that very well accepted, more recent lead isochron age gave an age of 2.6 billion years. Now, I know your head is just spinning with all these numbers I just spewed out at you, but hang on to this and think about this. The most accurate method, that lead isochron, at the lowest, oldest supposed layer of lava in the Grand Canyon came up with 1.1 billion. The same method used at the lava at the top came up with 1.4 billion. In other words, the layers of the cake at the top turned out to be older than the layers of cake at the bottom. It makes no sense. It can't possibly be true. So what do the evolution believers and geologists who hang on to this geometrical column of the geological layers say? Well, they say, well, you know, the stuff at the top just carried with it really old stuff from way deep down and deposited at the top. Well, maybe. How do you know that didn't happen at the bottom? How do you know that doesn't happen when we measure the basalt from Devil's Tower? You see, you can't know. And you get an enormous variety of these ages all over the place. And furthermore, through without the measurement of volcanically deposited rock layers, when we know the volcanoes erupted recently, we get ages that are millions and tens of millions of years old, even when it erupted in historical times. Again, I'll show you many examples of this. The Hulilani basalt, which we know erupted 200 years ago, was dated at 600,000 years ago. Mount Etna basalt erupted 29 years ago. It measured 35 million years old. Not 29 years, 35 million years old using radiometric dating methods. Mount Lasan, 85 years ago, measured 11 million. The Sunset Crater erupted, we think, about 1,000 years ago, measured 27 million years ago. The Medicine Lake eruption, less than 500 years ago, measured 13 million years old, and on and on and on. You see, these are called discordant measurements. They don't match what we know to be true because we actually know the true date. They happen all the time in radiometric dating methods. Very different methods with different isotopes give very different results. They are simply thrown out and considered discordant. Well, they don't match what we know to be true. How do we know the ones we're accepting are true? The fact is we don't. They're merely accepted because they fit the existing paradigm of slow, gradual progression of the geological record. So keep these things in mind when you hear about the old ages. You're getting hand-picked, selected data that fits an existing paradigm. You're not getting an absolute measurement of time that has passed.